Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 240. Today we're going to be continuing our unit on the death penalty. This time around, we're going to look at a paper by Stephen Nathanson called An Eye for an Eye. So the imagery we've got here is from a movie that has something to do with the question of criminal punishment, A Clockwork Orange, but the image we chose for this interesting eye imagery as well. So here's the plan for today. We'll do a super fast review of Igor Primoratz's argument in favor of the death penalty. And then we're going to look at Stephen Nathanson's essay, An Eye for an Eye. And we're going to look at his objections to the principle known as the lex talionis, and moreover his broader case against the death penalty. So just to review, we've got different ways of thinking about the justification for punishment overall. So one view we can call retributivism, and that's the view that a punishment is justified if and only if and because it gives a criminal his just deserts. So the thought here is that somebody is getting the right punishment just so long as it's what they deserve. And if you don't deserve a punishment, then it's not correct. And we might contrast this with deterrence theory, the view that punishment is justified if, only if, and because it is an efficient way of preventing crime. And one way we might think about this distinction is that retributivism is backward-looking. It's responsive to facts about what happened in the past. What you did in the past determines what the right punishment for you will be. Whereas a deterrence theory is all about what punishment is right for you is the one that will prevent the most possible crime in the future. And we also noticed that a backward-looking theory is more deontological in character, whereas deterrence is one version of a consequentialist justification of punishment. And we might notice that there might be some problems with deterrence theory. So for instance, some punishments of innocent people might actually deter others from committing crimes. If enough people mistakenly believed that a person committed a crime, if we could cause fewer people to commit that crime by framing somebody for it and then punishing them in a very public way and in a very extreme way, then according to that theory, that punishment would be justified. So Primoratz is interested in retributivism, and we'll see actually Nathanson is a retributivist as well, though he will not argue in favor of the death penalty. And remember, we also saw the specifics of Primoratz's argument. So remember, he said that punishment should be proportionate to the crime. So that's like a way of explaining how retributivism works. What you deserve is proportionate to what you do. Primoratz then argues that the only punishment proportionate to murder is the death penalty. Therefore, the punishment for murderers should be the death penalty. So premise one seems to be something pretty close to a principle known as lex talionis, which is the principle of an eye for an eye. So the idea would be something like, if your wrongdoing causes someone to lose an eye, well, you should lose an eye of your own. If you knock out a tooth from somebody, well, now you deserve to get one of your teeth knocked out, and so forth. So it requires treatment for criminals in the way that they treat their victims. And then premise two in Primoratz's argument was based on an idea that suggested that if we take seriously the idea of equality between humans and the infinite worth of a human life, Primorat says that the death penalty is the only way to correctly respond to a murder. So here's Nathanson's main point. He says that appeals to lex talionis, this principle of an eye for an eye, is not going to be adequate as a defense of the death penalty. So, remember, it's about what criminals deserve, and more specifically, lex talionis says whatever the criminal did to their victim is to be done in turn to the criminal. They cause someone to lose an eye, the criminal should then lose an eye of their own. So, Nathanson calls this view equality retributivism, equal treatment for criminals as compared to what they did to their victim. But Nathanson sees problems for this view. The biggest problem that he sees is that it requires inhumane treatment, or it requires us to do rightly immoral things, right? So he says that if we take lex talionis at its word, we would have to rape rapists, we would have to torture torturers. But the argument would say, look, raping and torturing are never okay. So any theory that requires us to rape people or torture people cannot be the correct theory of morally justified punishment. He further points out that lex talionis also has trouble explaining what the correct punishment is for other kinds of crime. So he says, it doesn't tell us how to deal with embezzlers, people who conceal the sources of their money, spies, air polluters. We might also think about cases of things like prostitution or sex offenders. It would seem wrong to say that like for a prostitute, if the wrong that they do is sell sex for money, it's not like you should sell sex to the prostitute for money. That doesn't make any sense, right? A lot of these cases we might think about as related to victimless crimes, that there's no identifiable victim or no specific harm that can be repaid in turn. So the problem here would be that lex talionis can't be the be-all, end-all of our theory of criminal punishment and what people deserve. Maybe it is the case that embezzlers, spies, air polluters, maybe prostitutes deserve some kind of punishment. But the thought would be, lex talionis gives you no guidance. We might also think about unintentional crimes. So for instance, we might think about something like manslaughter. Does the fact that somebody kills a person but accidentally make a difference to how we apply lex talionis? So Nathanson concedes that maybe the defender of lex talionis is not going to willingly admit that rapists should be raped, right? They might say, you can replace one punishment with another punishment just so long as it's roughly equal. So then we might say that a punishment should produce an amount of suffering in the criminal which is equal to the amount of suffering suffered by the victim. This is supposed to get us around the objection that lex talionis would require us to rape rapists. But Nathanson says we really still get the same problem, because if we have to do something other than a rape, which brings about an equal amount of suffering as you would get with a rape, you'd still be doing something horrifying and monstrous and barbaric to the criminal. So still no good, even when you modify lex talionis. So it's still going to require us to do immoral things. And again, still doesn't give us any advice about how to punish certain criminals like spies or air polluters. So if anything, it's not a necessary and sufficient condition for explaining what punishments are deserved. It might be sufficient, but not necessary. But then if we admit that, it's going to get a lot more complicated in working out our theory of what people deserve and what punishments are correct ones. Moreover, when we follow this principle, it's possible that the death penalty isn't the only thing sufficient for a just punishment for murderers. So it might be that a life in prison would be just as disagreeable as being put to death. So even on this modified lex talionis, we might no longer be able to reach the conclusion, to validly reach the conclusion that we are morally required to put somebody to death when they commit murder. So Nathanson proposes that instead of lex talionis, we should replace that principle with a different principle. So Nathanson is following von Hirsch. I believe his name is Andrew von Hirsch. Yeah, Andrew von Hirsch. And von Hirsch's idea, and this is how, this is von Hirsch's words quoted in Nathanson. He says, "Only grave wrongs merit severe penalties. Minor misdeeds deserve lenient punishments, and disproportionate penalties are undeserved, severe sanctions for minor wrongs, or vice versa." So the idea here is that we do capture something about retributivism, right? Every wrongdoer should get what they deserve. So the worst kinds of crimes should get the worst kinds of punishments. Moderate crimes should get moderate punishments. And trivial crimes should get trivial punishments. So the thought would be, if the worst crime is murder, then we should give the worst punishment to a murderer. If the most trivial crime is a parking violation, then we should give the most trivial punishment to the parking violator. Something like a small $25 ticket, which is maybe only $15 if you pay it the day of online, as it is the case in some smaller cities. If our worst punishment is life in prison, then we might think about what our 20-year crimes are, what our 10-year crimes are, what our 5-year crimes are, what our 1-year crimes are, and so forth. And we get injustice if you had a trivial crime that led to the worst punishment. So it would be a bad thing if we put a person into prison for the rest of their life for prostitution. Moreover, it would be an injustice if, for the worst crime, something like murder or aggravated serial rape, that only led to tickets, right? So the idea here is we're trying to preserve this idea of proportionality. But Nathanson points out that it's compatible, this view, worst crime gets the worst punishment, that we have an upper limit on punishments. So the thought here is that the worst punishment could be set at life in prison, and sentencing somebody to death would be beyond the upper limit, But as long as we've got proportionality, worst punishment for worst crime, and so forth. So, you never have like a mismatch of rank, right? But the thought here is that this approach to retributivism, proportional retributivism, clearly does not yet guarantee that the death penalty is what morality requires. So that's, the first part of Nathanson's argument. It's basically the thought that lex talionis gives us the wrong advice. It requires us to do immoral things. It gives us no guidance whatsoever, especially when we're thinking about crimes where no harm is identifiable. And moreover, we can get what's plausible about retributivism, but in a way that might still require us to never put people to death. So not only does Nathanson argue that common sense and plausible moral principles don't require us to issue the death penalty, he also argues that it would be a good thing not to, right? So to say that we don't have to is one thing, and that's basically what he achieves by arguing against lex talionis and replacing it with proportional retributivism. He then further points out that banning the death penalty, making it clear that we would not do this, also expresses something important. So sometimes we talk about how certain laws have an expressive function. They show what we care about. So, for instance, if we have hate crime laws, we might think that one thing that hate crime laws do is they express an abhorrence towards racism and discrimination. Well, we might think that banning the death penalty would have an expressive function. And one expressive function is to show respect for human life. The thought is it always has sanctity or dignity. And Nathanson, in this context, makes a distinction between personal desert and human desert. And he says that personal desert is what you deserve for your personal achievements, right? So we might think that, particular people deserve personal honors or awards, for instance, for the good things that they've done, right? If you make the best movie of the year, you personally deserve to win the Oscar for Best Picture, right? But human desert is about what you deserve simply for being human. So it's respect for your life is something that you deserve just in virtue of being the kind of being that you are, right? You don't have to be a good human in order to deserve the most basic things. And what Nathanson has in mind here is respect for your life, right? He says that this is kind of what we're getting at when we're thinking about the Declaration of Independence and the way that it speaks so highly of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everybody deserves those kinds of things, no matter how good or bad they are. So we talked about inalienable rights last time around. Well, yeah, Nathanson is saying here that, the core of human dignity, the part of you worth respecting simply in virtue of being human, is inalienable and unforfeitable. So because human beings, in virtue simply of being human beings, have dignity, there are certain things you can never do to them, right? You should never rape, murder, or torture somebody simply because they're a human being. Then there's a second point, which is that if we got rid of the death penalty, we'd show a good example, right? Respect for human dignity and the right to life is a fragile thing. Through much of history, Nathanson has pointed out, the right to life has been treated as something kind of precarious. And if we say that this is a line we will not cross, that might sort of stop the cycle of meeting violence with violence. So that's sort of the second part of Nathanson's argument, is to say that we would be doing something morally worthy in and of itself by refusing to put people to death, no matter how bad they are. So just to sum up, there are challenges on both sides of this debate, right? It's hard to make the lex talionis give straightforward and plausible answers in all cases about justice. And that's going to make it a bit harder for someone to argue in favor of the death penalty on the most obvious principle for justifying it. But, abolitionist arguments aren't airtight either. So, for instance, proportional retributivism in and of itself doesn't tell us where the upper limit has to be placed for punishments, or about what kinds of things we have to do to a person in order to respect their dignity. And insofar as you might have retributivist intuitions in yourself, you might have the intuition that people lose all of their rights when they murder somebody else. And if you think that, then you may not be persuaded by the kind of argument that Nathanson is making. So we've been arguing sort of on deontological grounds so far. You might start thinking about how other ethical theories might work through these questions. So you might think about how a utilitarian would want to think about the death penalty. On the one hand, they might say, there might be considerations involving deterrence that favor the use of the death penalty. They might also look to information about the lack of deterrence that the death penalty has compared to other methods, and also that it's costly and that it brings more suffering into the world. Or you could think about virtue ethics, right? So virtue ethics tells us that an agent is required to do what all virtuous agents would do. And we might wonder, is it possible for a virtuous agent acting in character to put a wrongdoer to death, even in cases when they don't have to? So those would be some things for you to think about. In any case, keep up the hard work and be in touch. So thanks for listening today.